Peter, if we are to worship a God, we have to know what that God is, and there are different expressions of God. And one of the classical critical characteristics is that God is a person. In fact, if God were not a person, which many believe, then there'd be no reason to worship it. Is that right?
I agree. I mean, a lot of people will tell you that you can't say anything literally of God and so on and so forth, and that God is beyond personality. Well, I think it would be rash at best and idolatrous at worst to worship something that you know not what. Just some sort of something that's sort of, you have a kind of impressive experience of the numinous or something. To worship such a being, I think, would be extremely, I said, at best rash, because to worship involves trust, submission, as in the word Islam. And why would you submit or trust yourself to something that's just sort of kind of mind-blowing, but you can't say anything about it? And the only thing we know of that we could submit ourselves to would be a person or persons of sufficiently good character and sufficient power for us to trust much more than we can trust ourselves, or at least more. So I think it is required of worship that God be personal, and also required of worship that God be sufficiently powerful.
Okay, so now we're saying that if we are going to worship, God needs to be a person, maybe other things too, like all-powerful. Of course, that doesn't mean that the being responsible for the creation of reality is a person. That means that we've just established that in order to worship it, it needs to be a person. Now, can we then take it one step more fundamental and say that the thing that is responsible for existence is a person? That seems like a pretty big leap of something.
Well, there we have the difficulty in deciding what a person is. I mean, usually these days what we mean is the sort of thing of which we are paradigms, and we are examples. If you ask what a person is, we say, well, look, there are plenty in this room. And then you might ask, well, are chimpanzees persons? And you might and a bit and say in some respects and so on.
Well, what does a person have? A person has awareness, I would think, knowledge, intentions, beliefs. Those are kinds of characteristics of persons.
Yes, and I think some kind of character,
Okay.
Emotions.
A nature,
emotions. Now, the sort of being that is treated as the ultimate explanation by theists is a being who has at least some of those characteristics, who's aware. The being has to be aware of possibilities, and there has to be a choice. Now, this is a very stripped down idea of person. And the problem is whether this minimal idea of person is enough to make a being worthy of worship. And this bears on this whole issue of the God of the philosophers versus the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you read the Old Testament, which I advise against if you're of a suggestible nature, you will discover that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a rather nasty individual. In that I agree with Richard Dawkins. Nonetheless, we make this contrast between, following Pascal, we make this contrast between the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What we mean is the God of the philosophers versus the God of religious traditions. Now, more is said of God in the religious traditions than that God has this very stripped down, minimal person qualities of being knowledgeable and agency. God is thought of as having at least some kind of character, as being loving and kind. Now, that such a God, I think, is worthy of worship. I have my doubts as to whether this idea of God as this sort of minimal person who just has power and awareness is worthy of worship. So the question is, can we get from one to the other, or do we say something like this? Well, that was the God of the philosophers, but revelation or human tradition or something suggests a different kind of God. I've suggested that maybe God could change. God could start off as this minimal kind of person and then become something with a richer sort of personhood. I'd also like to add here the idea of the Trinity, or in particular what's called social Trinitarianism, which is the idea that the best thing, the perfect thing, is really a community, not just a single individual, and that the Trinity is a community of persons united by love. And so God might become a community, might become three persons in the richer sense. And now we have something which is definitely personal in our ordinary sense of the word.
If you introduce the Trinity, that brings up, it seems to me, a whole bunch of other issues. Why not, if you want to have social activities, why the minimum three? Why not 5 or 7, and then you can go on to infinity? I mean, it's that seems to complexify the nature of God and persons rather rapidly.
Yes, there is a complexity in it, which is why I myself have suggested the radical and no doubt highly heretical view that God didn't start off as a Trinity because the ultimate explanation need to be simple. Now, why 3? Well, my own sort of view on the matter is that we would need at least 2 for a community. 3 is probably better. But why not an infinite number? I believe Aquinas discusses that somewhere. Well, I'm not concerned about that. When I say I believe in the Trinity, I mean I believe in at least 3. I have no reason to speculate on this. So is that sort of complexity? Is that sort of complexity a theoretical problem? Well, it would be if it was just ultimate. It would be if you said, oh, well, the initial state of affairs is this threesome. That would be complicating matters. And that's why I suggested developing into that. But there are other issues, of course, connected with the Trinity and personhood, which is the idea of, if we have 3 separate persons, do we really have 3 gods? And
you never get out of that one. You never can fully develop that. I mean, that's a
well, I don't know. No, I disagree. I don't think there's a problem here. I think that we need to be careful here about what we mean by persons, and try to avoid the idea that because we are persons, we understand what it is to be a person. And I think this works in several ways. And one way in which we have to be careful is not to assume that a person is a kind of isolated individual. And curiously, in many less individualistic cultures, nonetheless, there's the idea of gods, a plurality of gods, who are individuals, very much like the stereotype individuals that we are probably critical of in our culture. You know, we tend to, those of us who reflect upon these things tend to think, well, isn't it terrible that we seem to value these people who are, striving to be individuals, the celebrities and so on. And the curious thing is that in cultures where the mass of people may have been less individualistic, the gods and goddesses are exactly like the celebrities, the film stars. But it's that sort of idea of a person being a sort of isolated sort of atom, a sort of psychological atom that we need to avoid if we're to think of the Trinity as 3 persons. But I think the fluidity of our idea of person and our growing realization that we don't fully understand what persons are removes a lot of the sense that the Trinity is just a contradiction.
And so how then do you look at the general question, can the divine be persons?
Well, the way I look at it is this. There is a tension here. We want or we need an ultimate explanation that is as simple as possible, and that goes against treating the divine as personal. But on the other hand, religious traditions and the longing for something to worship, those of us who have it at least, seems to require that the divine be personal. And for what it's worth, I've thrown out the fairly wild speculation that God changes from the impersonal or the God of minimal personality, stripped down idea of a person that we need as the ultimate explanation, to becoming the kind of personal God, and in particular becoming a Trinity that we can worship and whose life we can ultimately participate in.